The Tomb Kings quite literally rule over the desert. If you want to take a walk along the sandy dunes of the Immortal Empire's map, chances are you'll need to either buddy up to them or more likely take them on in war and combat. So how do you rattle these skeletal monarchs? Let's take a look and find out right after a word from Instant Gaming. If you like games and you don't like painful price, then Instant Gaming is exactly what you've been looking for. They have thousands of all the best games for sale on every platform at a lower price than you can find them almost anywhere else. They even have a browser extension that shows the prices for their games directly on Steam, so you know you're getting the best price possible. Check them out at the link in the description and pick yourself up some cheap games whilst supporting the channel. Thanks again to Instant Gaming for sponsoring this video. So let's start off as usual with the campaign, and as usual, there's not really much to worry about with the Tomb Kings. They only have a couple of mechanics, and the first one is to watch out for their unique approach to recruitment. Whilst they can only recruit so many units of each type due to the capacity system, they can recruit units for free no matter their tier, and if we're talking basic tier 1 units, that means full stacks for free pretty much right out the gate. This isn't too much of a problem a little later on as long as you have better units. Auto-resolve should take your side, but on the odd occasion it doesn't. You may need to fight a battle where you are outnumbered, and whilst this can be easily winnable by ensuring you aren't surrounded, it can be intimidating seeing their full stacks just wandering around. Just remember to check what you're working with before you panic and use heroes to scout out their armies before you attack to make sure you know what you're getting into. Alongside this, they have a couple of rights to look out for. The Great Incantation of Petra allows them to summon a necrotech that can colonize runes to level 3, so if you see one of these guys scuttling towards some runes you want, be prepared to send over an assassin or army depending how far you have to travel. The most threatening right is the Great Incantation of Kashar. This causes all their regions to be hit by sandstorms, causing heavy attrition to all foreign armies, as well as giving them a huge boost to their ambush success chance. They're not the Skaven, so they still have to lie in wait for you to spring their trap, but still, if you see sandstorms covering their lands, proceed with caution and lead your army with some heroes to check if the coast is clear. Moving over to the battle side of things, the Tomb King roster is quite small and concentrated, but that doesn't mean they're easy to fight. Early on, it'll be mostly skeleton spam of various kinds, but the more the game goes on, the more beefy constructs will start to appear, and the beefier they'll become. So let's go through the different aspects of their rosters to look out for and what to do about them. First up, we have their melee infantry, and across the board, they're decent. Nothing here is crazy overpowered, but everything is at least pretty good. Defense is very decent, but their armor stays quite low, leaving them quite vulnerable to even less armor-piercing ranged units, even with their various shields. Damage isn't half bad either, though only their final halberd tomb guard units have armor piercing, so they're not going to do too great against anything but chaff. The purpose of these front lines is to be a wall of meat, or in this case bones, to use to protect their constructs, so I wouldn't worry about their damage and instead try to work around their defense. Ideally, you ignore these guys and focus on the real key targets, but if you really need to get rid of them, then spells are a great shout, with Law of Fire being an excellent choice thanks to their much lower armor, even for the high tier units. Failing that, then lots of area damage from monsters of your own would work great, or simply a bunch of range spam, preferably from the flanks, to work around their shields. We also have a very small but strong selection of cab and chariots. Now the caveat for this is that they're only really useful during the mid game, but they're still worth being ready for. They're all sporting relatively high speed and a decent damage output, again lacking any armor piercing, hence why they're relegated to the mid game only. With the exception of the chariots, both melee cav have decent melee stats, making them quite a terror to your backlines with cycle charging or sustained combat. Of course, pinning any of these units down pretty much negates them completely, so if you can do that, it's an easy win to keep yourself safe. Anything fast with high damage should also be able to take them down pretty easily, especially the chariot, which is essentially useless when it's not charging. While they're good, they're really good, so just keep an eye out during the mid game and react accordingly. The constructs is where the majority of their power and roster lies. They have a ton of options ranging from the basic Ushabti monstrous infantry to the colossal casting hero titan, and each one is built for a specific purpose, making general advice fairly challenging. For the majority of their melee options, fighting them on the front lines is going to be a struggle. Their damage output is simply insane, so trying to outdamage them will be a real challenge unless you fully commit with factions like the Beastmen. The easiest strat is to focus purely on defense and buy ranged infantry time to take care of them. They might be big, powerful monsters, but they're still big, meaning you can pretty easily pick them apart with missiles without worrying too much about friendly fire. Toss a few armor-piercing missiles their way and they'll fall to pieces in moments, and all your troops have to do is shoot the equivalent of a barn door flailing around in combat. Some of their small options like the Ushabti and Necropolis Knights might be a little bit harder to get an angle on, but just do your best with the major threats first and come back to pick off what's left. Speaking of Necropolis Knights, they and most of these constructs come with some pretty high speed, making them viable at flanking. Now the AI will probably not try this too much outside of the Sepulchral Stalkers and Necropolis Knights, but it's worth keeping an eye out to make sure you're not getting outmaneuvered, as they can cause you some real trouble if they get into your precious backlines. Alongside the melee constructs, they also have a few ranged options as well as their small but mighty artillery roster. Both ranged monstrous infantry share some of these same aspects, but both work very differently to each other. Ushabti greatbows have excellent long range and deal great armor-piercing damage, best used versus other large targets to make the most of their high-damage missiles. Sepulchral Stalkers, however, have a much shorter range, but also stalk, allowing them to sneak up behind enemies and get off their armor-piercing magical damage up close and personal. The Bone Giant literally fires a giant bow, dealing devastating damage to whoever it hits, again, preferably a single target. The Screaming Skull and the Casket of Souls both perform the same job in different ways, with extreme range and massive area damage, devastating infantry units with ease. With the exception of the last two artillery pieces, the ranged constructs are also fairly decent in melee. They're nowhere near as good as the melee-focused options and will still go down with relative ease when attacked, they'll just get their licks in before they do. Options for taking these guys down is the same as the other constructs, just now you have the added task of closing the gap to get them into melee in the first place. Using some fast-moving cav or monsters with high armor pacing and on bonus versus large is a good shout, since it'll deal great damage and also stop them from dealing any of their own. But if you haven't the option, then ranged focused will work. Just make sure you really prioritize them hard to make sure they get no value, or even worse, take out your ranged units before you can do the same to them. Their leadership is a little bit limited, but nevertheless has some pretty powerful aspects. They have a single lord who's a decent basic melee fighter, but can have some pretty great mounts up to and including a War Sphinx, which is pretty strong. They also have the choice of a few decent lords of magic, including their unique Law of Nehekara, which isn't one of the decent ones, but it is there. And they also have Necrotex who fight closely alongside constructs to keep them healthy and in fighting form, with all kinds of passive and active buffs. It's a small selection, but it has a lot of potential, so if you see a character you can easily take out, by all means do it. This will not only take out their value, but it will also help lower nearby leadership, which is especially detrimental because, did I mention, the roster has the undead mechanic. This essentially means their units don't run away at low leadership and instead start to take increasing amounts of damage over time until they crumble away to nothing. This can be worked around by manually running away at low leadership, but this is Total War AI we're talking about here, so that will quite literally never happen. And if you thought their constructs were safe because they're machines, wrong. They also have the construct mechanic, which is basically the same thing, but it's different for a trait reason. All this boils down to, if you can get the leadership of the Tomb King armies low, they'll fall apart without you having to do anything, so use all the leadership sapping tactics you can think of, like surrounding enemies, cycle charging their flanks, taking out their lords and heroes, and even leadership debuff spells. If you can get them breaking, the following combat will be a breeze as they slowly dissolve into nothing. And the final thing to know about the Tomb Kings in battle is the Realm of Souls. All skeleton-based units benefit from the Realm of Souls mechanic, which comes into effect once certain numbers of Tomb Kings fall in battle. Each tier provides healing over time for increasing durations, with the final tier also providing an ability allowing them to summon a unit of Shabti anywhere on the battlefield. It's very straightforward and just means they get a little boost of healing every now and then. If you have a Firecaster and can time your spells to match these boosts, you'll prevent a lot of healing, as well as racking up a ton of damage. That said, on the whole, I wouldn't worry about this too much, since outside of healing reduction, there's not a lot of counterplay, and even if there was, the healing isn't really that worth worrying about anyway. Use Shabti, however, so keeping out for them spawning on your ranged infantry when you're not looking, but aside from that, just play as normal. Now, to build a comp to counter this, if you're playing as a faction with ranged options, it's going to be very similar to the usual. For the front lines, we're going to focus on defense since the Tomb King damage output is extremely high, so trying to match it would just be a wasted effort, and you'd have to spend 6 turns replenishing after every battle. For Empire, Halberdiers are the way to go since they've got the best defense, plus that bonus versus large, they'll also do well against those constructs and get some decent hits in while they're holding the line. For ranged infantry, we're going to focus on armor pacing and not worry about firing arc. The constructs are a major threat and most of them are pretty massive, so we don't need to worry about friendly fire. Just get that damage output as high as possible and focus fire key targets one at a time to take them down fast. Be sure to keep your ranged infantry well back, as some larger constructs will be able to pull through your front lines, so you want to make sure they don't plow through straight into your ranged infantry while they're at it. Also keep an eye on your flanks for stalkers and knights, being sure to focus fire in if they get too close before they can get too much value. As usual, anti-large cav or fast monsters are also a great pick. They'll do great against all constructs and will be fast enough to take down artillery or ranged constructs on the enemy backlines, which will be major threats to your forces. Taking these down fast will be the key to minimizing damage, so prioritize them as soon as you can. If they have good melee stats, they can also intercept stalkers and knights before they can flank. Just make sure it's a matchup they can win. For leadership, I'd focus on keeping front lines confident. We don't really need a duelist all that much, especially if it's human-sized, as they simply won't trade all that well into giant construct mounts. As long as they have plenty of buffing auras to keep front lines confident, that should work just fine. A caster would also be a great option, especially if you can get some leadership sapping spells in there to crumble their units as fast as possible. Fire is also a great shout to counter their healing and also capitalize on the general lack of armor for most of their non-construct units. If you're instead playing a more melee-focused faction like the nearby Khorne, then obviously things will work a little bit differently. I'd still stick with a more defensive front lines infantry, mainly because Exalted Bloodletters are demonic, so kinda stinky, but it also provides a nice base for your other units to come and deal all the real damage. We're going to bolster these front lines with Great Weapons Minotaurs for tons of armor pacing anti-large damage onto those constructs, as well as some Bloodthirsters for just a little bit more for the real big targets. Skull Crushers are a great cav option with some anti-large bonus, allowing them to get around the front lines and into their range for massive damage, both from charging and sustained combat. And lastly, lead them with an Exalted Bloodthirster because obviously, as well as some Blood Reapers on Blood Thrones for those delicious auras on the front lines. You can tweak this depending on your exact faction, but the bottom line is, lots of anti-large damage for melee and tons of armor piercing for ranged, with a healthy dose of leadership sapping wherever you can get it. And that's everything you need to know for how to beat the Tomb Kings. Let me know any tips of your own in the comments below. Vote on who you want to see how to beat next in the Discord linked in the description. Like, subscribe, and if you want to see how to beat more factions, then how about this video on how to beat the Lizardmen?